in case anybody has that.
I know, but we can only set your stories for their audience.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, UVI. Good afternoon. Albert and Sheen St. Croix campus, good afternoon. Good afternoon. And the St. Thomas campus. I'm Darren Cooper. I'm just giving you a brief tidbit before I depart and go up to the radio station. We are streaming right now, and radio station, you can go live. We're streaming on Facebook on WUVI Radio, and we'll be sharing that. And we're also audio streaming on wuvi.uvi.edu. So for those of you that have friends, other students who couldn't make it, it is airing live on 97.3 FM. It is streaming, it's being recorded, both audio and video-wise. So there will be ways to share this after, and there'll be ways to share it while it's live as well. Okay, so I'm representing the students who are at the radio station, both campuses. So we got 2 studios, one on each campus, but 1 radio station. And again, that's 97.3 FM. And the website that all of this can be accessed on, the audio stream, the video, everything, the Facebook and everything, is wuvi.uvi.edu. So everything's there, okay? And St. Croix, I know once they start speaking over here, if it's muted over there, the feedback and all the different noises and everything will be able to work out better. I know that there'll be a question and answer segments at that point. If someone over there can unmute, then that'll probably make more sense. And we will be joining you all via Polycom as well from the communications lab. Both campuses will be tuning in through Polycom. We're going to try in a few. But welcome.
Thank you. Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, St. Thomas. Good afternoon, St. Croix.
And you may want to go ahead and use that.
I'd like to welcome some distinguished guests that we have in the audience today, starting with Dr. Marilyn Braithwaite Hall, President Hall's wife, and his daughter, Sikile Braithwaite Hall. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I would like to also welcome Dean Ingerman, who has been very supportive of this event. Dean Marie Ingerman is the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. I also see that we have Dean Sandra Romano here. Thank you for coming very much. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all UVI faculty, staff, and the many students who are here. And we have invited guests near and far who are actually watching us and listening in. I have a special shout out today. It's my son Alex's 21st birthday, and he's listening live from Richmond, Indiana. And we were also very fortunate to have Tech Wizardry in the house, who also has a birthday, Majestic. And so special shout out to everybody. It's hard for me to see who's on St. Croix, but welcome. Good to have you. On behalf of the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences and the Department of Social Sciences, I'm very excited to welcome you to UVI today. When I initially started planning this event, it was more going to be something like have Dr. Sewer come talk to students in a few classes. However, once word got out that Dr. Sewer was going to give a talk here at UVI, I was given requests from other individuals to please, they wanted to attend, and if they couldn't attend in person, could we make sure this talk was going to be streamed. This is because people who are familiar with Dr. Sewer's scholarship and her commentary on social issues in the VI know that what they'll hear today will expand them or perhaps even change them. No one, whether a native Virgin Islander or a transplant like myself, will think about the VI quite the same way after you engage with her ideas. She challenges many people's assumptions about what is and pushes people to reimagine a future for the VI that is not bound by its colonial past. The importance of this at this time cannot be overstated. Contemplating this future has literal consequences for what a recovered VI will look like. Thus, it is both my pleasure and an honor to introduce you today introduce her today to those of you who do not know her already. Dr. Hadiyah Sewer earned her bachelor's degree in sociology from Spelman College, where she was a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow. She next earned both her master's degree and PhD in Africana Studies from Brown University. Her dissertation, successfully defended last spring, is entitled Possession and Phenomenology of American Colonialism in St. John, Virgin Islands. This fall, she assumed a position as a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Black Studies Research at the University of California, Santa Barbara, which many of us already know that this is just the first step on an illustrious career for Dr. Sewer. In addition to emphasizing her professional credentials, it's equally important to note that Dr. Sewer was born on St. Thomas and raised on St. John. I'm especially thrilled that today we have with us at UVI an activist scholar born and raised in the Virgin Islands, whose scholarship is about the Virgin Islands and whose philosophies as a scholar are unapologetically inspired by her identity as a Virgin Islander. I hope her presence here today also encourages some of our students here at UVI to follow her lead as they come to appreciate the truly invaluable perspective they can bring to research and academic discourse in all areas, and especially so when their lived experience is the subject of the academic enterprise. So, please be prepared to be transformed today and join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Sewer.
Good afternoon. How are you all doing today? You're something a little wonderful. Beautiful? Okay, great. So first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Yeager for organizing this talk this afternoon. And also, I would like to thank all of you for coming out. It's always an absolute pleasure to be able to have the opportunity to share my research, not only in settings on the continental United States, but actually to be able to come home where the research is rooted, but I think also where it's most relevant and critical. So it's not just like a theoretical enterprise for us, it's actually about our lived experience and about what it would mean for us to actually be able to survive and to move forward as we kind of chart a political future for ourselves here in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So I'd like to thank, obviously the Department of Social Sciences and the College of Liberal Arts, especially like to thank Professor Dara Monica Cooper, Dr. Davis, all of the staff and students, especially over at WUBI Radio. I deeply appreciate your efforts to make this conversation accessible. And I'd like to thank those of you who are tuning in live. And I'm going to apologize in advance if I forget to stay near the mic. So please forgive me for that. And of course, to the students and all of those who are attending on the St. Croix campus and tuning in live, this is actually an absolute pleasure to be able to talk to you here this afternoon. So this talk, as you know by now, is called Colonialism Without Colonizers in the United States Virgin Islands. And so I'm going to start the talk by telling you a bit about this particular body of work, how it emerges, and how it's situated in my overarching dissertation that was mentioned earlier, Possession and Ethnographic Phenomenology of American Colonialism in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So Colonialism Without Colonizers is actually the 5th chapter of the overall manuscript, but it's actually the first chapter that I write. And the reason that I write it in this way And also the reason that it's so dear to my heart is I think that it becomes one of the most salient things that minimizes our ability to have, at times, productive discourses around political status in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So possession overall looks at what it means to be free and to be human in the United States Virgin Islands at this particular moment. Obviously, we're a 21st century American colony. We exist under the plenary power of Congress. We don't have full voting rights. We have a peripheral economy that caters to the metropole. We have a racist hierarchy in our political and social power structure. And yet still, we do not necessarily have active movements for independence or even a change in political status. We know that we have a history of pursuing this, but it hasn't necessarily taken root in the contemporary movement. And when we look at the post-colonial era across the world, and we see the rise of independence throughout other Caribbean islands, in continental Africa, even in other places in Latin America, we have to ask the question of why. Why exactly is it that as a people we are collectively interested in and or invested in our current political status? Now, this isn't necessarily even a critical statement. And what I mean by that is that this is not necessarily a judgment. It's merely an observation of who we are and how it is we're trying to navigate our society and achieve freedom through a way that doesn't necessarily look at nationalism as the height of the political freedom project. So if you heard the term phenomenology and you're really asking yourself, what exactly is phenomenology? Why would you do that? What discipline does phenomenology belong to? It's actually a method of research that's rooted in philosophy. And so while Africana studies is an interdisciplinary field, it has, sociology, or history, political science, economics, all of these different disciplines can be used to ask questions about the lived experience of people of African descent. It allows us, phenomenology and philosophy in particular, to ask questions about the existential nature about our experiences of people of African descent. And when we say existential, what I'm essentially also saying is that political power doesn't necessarily just operate through the social, economic, and political forces. It operates at the level of consciousness. And so if we're talking about freedom and we're talking about decolonization, we can ask more of the political questions about, well, can we do a survey on this particular matter? Can we figure out the sociological measurability of racial discrimination? We can ask all of those particular questions, but if we're talking about freedom, we also have to ask the question of how does it feel to be colonized? And in addition to how does it feel to be colonized, what does being free mean to people of predominantly African descent? Now, this is a very, important topic and conversation. Oh, okay. So it's an important conversation in the field of Africana studies and Black existentialism, because if we're looking at slavery and colonialism as totalizing systems of domination, then the thing that we know is that it's not just a process of oppressing people, it's a process of dehumanization. So people of African descent historically, and we see this through the vast body of literature on the subject, are excluded from the category of human throughout the project of slavery. So enslavement is not just based on the desire to accumulate wealth. We know that this is one of the motivating forces behind slavery and colonialism as we know it today. But in order to justify and rationalize the project, you have to be able to make an argument for why the people you're enslaving and colonizing are not necessarily human, and therefore not necessarily deserving of whatever freedom and social stature that people of the dominant race have. So across the Caribbean, across continental Africa, across the United States of America, the diaspora really, the conversation about freedom turns to a question of humanization. How do we rescue ourselves from this historical exclusion from the category of the human, what Orlando Patterson and others might call social debt? And how do we then chart a project for freedom that recognizes our humanity and challenges the assumption that we are an inferior group of people. Now, what becomes really important to me throughout the question of tracing colonialism and possession in the U.S. Virgin Islands is that we seem to be operating from the assumption that we are not quite colonized. And what I mean by that is that while we are technically under the plenary power of the United States Congress, when we have conversations, when I conducted interviews, when I did participant observations, as well as a lot of the conversations that you see taking place on social media, the term colonialism is largely absent from our collective discourse. And the shift around that is something that seems to be happening a bit more recently. And so a part of asking, well, why don't we necessarily think of the United States of America as a colonizer? You start to ask other questions about, well, you know, what does freedom look like to us? But also, how does the United States of America colonize in comparison to the European colonial powers? So when we talk about colonialism, we think of a really archaic project. For the most part, we've kind of decided that colonialism is a thing of the past. We kind of associate it, for the most part, with Christopher Columbus and men like him, pioneers, you know, people who come to the quote-unquote New World and decide that they're planting a flag and this is their land. But we don't always wonder or know how this project relates to our lived reality right now. It seems as though perhaps we are, you know, simply a territory, or perhaps we are choosing our relationship with the United States of America by virtue of not openly and actively criticizing and rejecting this current political status in favor of another one. But when we start to kind of look a little more closely, we start to realize that, you know, we desire quote-unquote freedom just like everybody else on the planet. And so if we are choosing this current political status, there's a reason why we're choosing this current political status. And so this project, possession in particular, is born as an attempt to ask what exactly is our view of freedom, and how does it lead us to accept colonial dependency in a moment that's widely regarded as post or neo-colonial across most of the world. So this body of literature engages with a lot of the existing scholarship on that subject, right? So I looked at a lot of scholars who study the United States Virgin Islands, Carlisle Corbin, Dr. Monique who, as well as Tammy Navarro, Isaac Dutkin, William Boyer, all of these people who wrote, you know, political theory or histories of the U.S. Virgin Islands. But then also my work dovetails specifically with two Caribbean women who are theorists, and one considers herself a philosopher, the other is a little theoretically rebellious and doesn't necessarily claim the discipline of philosophy, but it's Gertrude Gonzalez-Allen and Sylvia Winter. So Gertrude Gonzalez-Allen is a Prussian-born philosopher at Spelman College. I believe I saw somebody was from at Spelman College, who writes her dissertation, Settlements and Shadows, on Identity and Colonialism in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Sylvia Winter is a Jamaican theorist, scholar, dancer, activist, novelist, playwright. I think she was an actress at one particular point or the other. Sylvia Winter did all of the things, but ultimately, both of these women asked questions about freedom, philosophy, blackness, what it means to be human in the prevailing world, that are critically important for helping me to understand what exactly is taking place in the United States Virgin Islands. So Sylvia Winter in particular has a large body of scholarship on the human. She's written several texts as well as novels and plays. But one of the arguments that she puts forth is that our colonial project is not simply dependent upon these external constructs or social, political, and economic relations. That's the case. But it's also dependent on a particular idea of what it means to be human in the modern world. So when the colonial encounter takes place and you have Europeans arriving in the Caribbean and America, what they are enforcing is not simply the attempt to accumulate capital, but they are enforcing a particular construct of what it means to be modern, what it means to be civilized, what it means to be rational, what it means to be progressive. and they are arguing that the people that they are colonizing are the ultimate other. And therefore, as people who have been othered historically, a part of our freedom project at times is about resisting the ways in which we've been othered, but at other times it's also about trying to challenge this Western construct of humanity. So the question isn't simply, well, how do we pursue freedom at the social, political, and economic level? It is how do we resist what George Lamming would call the terror of the mind? How do we start to shape our consciousness to resist all of the ways in which society has told us time and time again that we are inferior? And not only this, but how do we start to trace all of the really subtle ways in which this idea about our inferiority starts to shape our own relationship to ourselves and to the other people in our community or society? So when we think about this inferiority, W.B. Du Bois would call it double consciousness. What he would say essentially is that we have these two conceptions of ourselves. One conception is the dominant society's perspective of us, and then the other perception is the way that we want to see ourselves in a radical, resistive, black, situated way. Now, Frantz Fanon would then say that colonialism produces an existential deviation. It creates a crisis in our consciousness. So we're no longer able to simply look at ourselves and our consciousness in the way that we want to be, but we start to grapple with all of the ways in which we've internalized this particular inferiority. Now, this raises a lot of questions for us in the US Virgin Islands in particular. But the reason it raises these questions for us is because if we're taking on this idea that power is not necessarily external to us, but actually a part of us, then we know that whatever it is that we desire for ourselves as an individual or collective body does not emerge in a vacuum. It means it's shaped by power. So, a small example, if I get up in the morning and I decide I want to go and drive a particular vehicle, my desire for transportation doesn't just emerge from nowhere. It emerges from a complex set of social, political, and economic factors that makes that vehicle available to me. And that tells me that perhaps it may be more convenient for me to get in the car, or alternatively to get on the bus. So when we start to think about what political status it is that we desire, we know that our desire for either the political status quo, independence, statehood, or free associated status is also rooted in a very particular set of social, political, and economic factors. And that desire is also shaped by these constructs or these conceptions of what it means to be human. And Sylvia Wynter would call the dominant society's conception of what it means to be human man. And so man for Sylvia Wynter is political, it's biological, and it's economic. It's biological in the sense that people of color, Black and Indigenous people, for example, were used as physical reference for an thing. The person who is fully regarded as human is somebody who has full access to citizenry in the American body politic. It's economic in the sense that man is driven by economic motivations, the accumulation of capital in particular. So if we are looking at our current situation and either being somewhat apathetic about it or having a strong desire for something else, but feeling a little bit helpless in terms of not necessarily knowing which way forward is going to be feasible or which way forward would actually lead us to the freedom that we desire, then this hesitation is political as much as it is personal. And we have to start to trace a lot of the levels in which we are invested and desire certain things, or political statuses, for example, that don't necessarily align with our values as it relates to freedom or democracy. Now, the reason I picked the United States Virgin Islands as the site for the research is obviously because I'm from the US Virgin Islands and I'm invested in what's going to happen here, but also because I think we're a very specific but also interesting geopolitical location. We are the only predominantly Black colony of the United States of America. And so if we understand our political subjugation in the context not just a political status, but also in the context of blackness and the ways in which structural racism operates in the continental United States of America, then we know that our political status question in many ways is connected to our identity as a predominantly Black people in the Caribbean. And when we trace this historically, it means that our desire for freedom and all of the ways in which it's hindered and or facilitated is actually related to the Caribbean at large, it's related to the African diaspora at large, but also it tells us something about the United States of America as a governing power. And I say the United States of America because there are only 17 remaining non-self-governing territories in the world, and the US has a handful of them, right? We have the Virgin Islands, we have Puerto Rico, we have American Samoa, we have Guam, we have the Northern Mariana Islands. And yet still, the United States of America is the empire of liberty, quote unquote. And so if we understand the United States of America as being the particular nation that advances this ideal of democracy while maintaining its colonial possessions, then we have to understand and ask some questions about, well, what is it about the United States of America that allows it to advance the ideals of democracy while simultaneously holding colonial possessions? How is that process justified and rationalized, not only to the people of the United States of America, but also to the colonial inhabitants, quote unquote. So the political status question in the Virgin Islands, comparatively speaking, lacks a certain level of visibility. When you talk to a lot of people in the contiguous US and you say, hey, I'm from the Virgin Islands, people will say, oh yeah, I've been to St. Vincent, or I've been to St. Martin, and they list a ton of islands that would give you the impression that you don't know anything about the Virgin Islands, and yet still our survival is dependent on our ability to know your history. And so we know that these kinds of relations are inherently colonial, but also we have to ask, what exactly is it about this particular set of conditions that we've come to accept? Now, I said earlier that I don't necessarily judge it, and I mean that. But I do mean that I still also desire a different political status. And in order to move forward, we kind of have to get through a lot of the really uncomfortable questions that we have about what it means to exist under the plenary power of Congress in a moment deemed largely post-colonial and neo-colonial. So possession means a lot of things in the dissertation itself. It talks about the legal possession of an unincorporated American territory, but it also talks about a psychic, existential process. The process by which a colonial power doesn't just remain external to you, but is a part of you. Now, if double consciousness is talking about seeing yourself in these two ways, then what possession means to me is that something about these two senses of self are starting to get blurred. Now, I've been asked by friends and colleagues, is this something that's unique to our contemporary moment? Can we argue that it's always been blurry historically for people of African descent? Or is there something about this particular time and space that makes it perhaps just a little more obscure? And I would argue that it's always perhaps been a little bit blurry, but under the context of slavery, how blurry can it really be? Or under the context of Jim Crow, how blurry can it really be? And in the early years of American colonial rule, if you don't know, Virgin Islanders didn't have American citizenship. So at that time, how blurry could it have actually been? You didn't have citizenship under the US flag. And so I argue that this blurring of these two conceptions of the self is something that's actually unique to neoliberalism, but also to a post-organic act period in the Virgin Islands. When we start to acquire US citizenship, when we start to abolish the colonial administration, and when we start to increase autonomy while still being blocked out of full access to American citizenry, it becomes a bit more difficult for us to clearly and efficiently, constantly recognize that we are dealing with colonialism, and that colonialism is entangled with all of these other systems of domination. And we know this. We say it in conversations, we describe colonialism, but we don't necessarily always actively use the term colonialism. And so in the 5th chapter of the dissertation, I built on Eduardo Benillo Silva's work to make the argument that it's important for us to name and identify colonialism. That the absence of the term in our day-to-day lexicon and our conversations, it's not coincidental. It's very purposeful, and it allows for the establishment of what Michel Foucault will call the regime of truth. And the regime of truth is a process in our everyday conversations and discourses by which power is policed. And so the regime of truth does not correlate to truth. What it is a set of ideas that allow those in power to maintain their supremacy. So if we're talking about colonialism without colonizers in particular, I put forth the explanation that the processes by which colonialism is normalized in the United States Virgin Islands today is one of the regimes of truth by which colonialism is normalized and interiorized as something that's just okay. It's not ideal, we might say on a day-to-day basis, that, we would like to maybe vote for President of the United States, or perhaps we're concerned about further integrating into the American body politic because we have a set of questions about what freedom would look like there. But ultimately, it does not, or colonialism specifically, does not become a system that we outright reject. So in February of 2016, the Department of the Interior held a panel, and our own Dr. Melise, who was present, and he was present alongside professors from Guam and American Samoa. And one of the conversations that took place at this panel on the plenary power of Congress was that Dr. Underwood, who was one of the representatives on the panel, made a statement. And he said, half jokingly, I might add, that the good thing about Spanish rule is that they always acknowledge that you were a colony. That's the good thing about being a colony under the European authorities. They always knew who was who. And in the American system, it's never really clear because there's no real department of colonial affairs. End quote. And then he also goes on to say that sometimes people refer to it as the C word. And he said he heard that yesterday before their panel. He said people were whispering to each other, did you hear that delegate from the United States Virgin Islands use the C word? And he was like, well, my goodness, it's surprising to me that people aren't using this term colonialism because I'm using it all the time. But ultimately, that silence, the need to whisper it, to kind of talk about it like it's not reality, but like it's a bad word, tells us something about how we feel about the colonial project, but also about how we are then able, or conversely, not able, to locate ourselves in the colonial project. So the ideas of American colonialism starts to seem wildly incongruent with America's value structure. And Gordon Lewis talks about this in an article on the Puerto Rican Constitution, and he also talks about it in his text, America's Virgin Islands, that can be endlessly put. But ultimately, throughout a lot of the dissertation fieldwork, the phrases that I would hear time and time again are, we're not a colony, we are a territory. I hate it when people act like we're not a part of the United States of America. How can we be a colony if we have a US passport and American citizenship? Or finally, and this is probably and arguably one of the more insidious ones, we're all American. We're all American. You can't necessarily conversate about American colonialism because I'm an American just like you, we're all American, we're here, it doesn't matter where we're from, and therefore it's problematic for you to bring up this conversation of colonialism to me. And so it's odd. And the odd thing about our insistence, or this collective insistence, that we aren't a colony, is that it's fundamentally untrue. If we look at almost every textbook definition of colonialism, the Virgin Islands fits it. The United Nations lists the Virgin Islands as one of the 17 remaining non-self-governing territories of the world. There's a committee on decolonization to monitor our status and our progress towards self-determination. It is clear that we are under the plenary power of Congress and we don't have full access to all the rights and privileges of the American body politic. And colonialism is a system of subjugation and domination. So it's the process by which a political entity expands and acquires another piece of territory. Now, scholars will debate this. What's the difference between colonialism and imperialism? No? You have a lot of overlap in the sense that imperialism is also a process by which a political entity seeks to expand its military or economic or political or social power through the control of another entity. But the difference between these two is that colonialism, on one hand, tends to have a settler colonial population, a group of people who move to the colony and who stay there. And then also in imperialism, the other entity at times is a sovereign nation state. You do not typically see this in a colonial power relation. So colonialism can be defined, according to Hadiyah, as conquest and control of other people's lands and goods. Now, if we are using the United States Virgin Islands as an example, we know that if the literature tells us that colonialism is epistemic, meaning it's about systems of knowledge, it's racialized, it's gendered, it's sex and sexual, it's economic, it's cultural, it has a psychic component. And if in his seminal text on colonialism, Amos Césaire tells us that colonialism is what he calls thingification, a system of no human contact, only relations of domination and submission, then we have to ask, how does this not describe the U.S. Virgin Islands as a socio-political entity? We exist under the plenary power of Congress. We have, or we are subjected to federal laws. However, we do not have voting representation at the federal level. And we were purchased for $25 million in gold. So in 1917, annexed without the consent of our VI ancestors, and then ultimately, the early period of American colonial rule is filled with overt forms of racism. So if you read Gordon Lewis's book, if you read Isaac Dickens' book, if you even have a moment to Google Rochelle Francis, Hamilton Jackson, the coal workers, and read some of the letters that they sent to people like W.E.B. Du Bois, then we start to realize that the people of the Virgin Islands from 1917, especially to the early 1930s, were actively campaigning against what they felt to be overt racist domination. Meaning, there was a sense in the territory at the time that racism under the Danish flag wasn't as bad as racism under the US flag. So you have many Virgin Islanders telling stories and tales of walking the streets and having racist encounters with military officials from the US Navy, since the territory is under the naval administration for these first decades. And they argued that they were unaccustomed to a certain extent to that degree of overt racist violence and brutality on the basis of race on the street. And so a lot of the initial organizing that was taking place in the Virgin Islands around increase in autonomy is taking place as a response to their experiences with racism under the US flag. So Albert Memmi tells us that racism summarizes, illustrates, and symbolizes the colonial project. So in the modern world, colonialism is entangled with its function to uphold the system of white supremacy. So when we say this, we mean that the colonial encounter is inherently racialized, since colonizers tend to be predominantly white from European nations, and those who are colonized, historically in the modern world, tend to be people of color. And if we look at the Virgin Islands, we know that this is also true in our particular situation. And we know that our exclusion from the American body politic is directly connected to our racial identities as U.S. Virgin Islanders. So if we look at the insular cases specifically, we start to see the legal history for this. Now, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 had established the expectation in the United States of America that all American territories would eventually become states. That was the original plan for territorial acquisition. There was never a plan in the 1700s to acquire territories and to keep them as territories. And so if you want to ask, well, what happened to that pathway between territorial status and statehood? We know that the Spanish-American War happened. And as the United States of America started to acquire territories that were occupied by people that they call people of alien races, they then felt as though there was a new question. And that question is, should the Constitution follow the flag? Should territories have a direct path to statehood? And this was a big debate. You had pro-imperialist American jurists and anti-imperialists having conversations with each other about whether or not it was morally acceptable to change the law, to change the governance of territories. Ultimately, the imperialists won, and they argued in the insular cases, which were a set of cases that begin from 1901 going down for a few decades, that the people of the territories are foreign in a domestic sense. What this means is we are not a part of the United States of America legally. We are foreign in a domestic sense. We are a tenant to, not a part of. And this ultimately is deeply rooted in American xenophobia, racism, and an American existential crisis about what would happen to the American body politic if we let in thousands to millions of people of color. They argued that it would fundamentally alter the American nation, and that the decision of the path forward would be to keep territories as territories and place them under the plenary power of Congress so that Congress can ultimately decide the future for the territories in question. So, and this is a quote from William Boyer's text where he does a reading of the evolution of the doctrine of incorporation, and he said, quote, "It is evident that the justice was much preoccupied by the danger of racial and social questions of a very perplexing character, and that he was quite desirous that Congress should have a very free hand with the new subject populations." So we are required, as the insular cases are being deliberated, and ultimately this desire to exclude the racial other in the quote-unquote colonies is applied to us. Now, we know that a lot of the motivations behind the purchase are influenced by military strength, but also economy. The United States of America is interested at this time in expanding its empire, and in order to be able to bolster its economy, you have to be able to defend such economy. So the plan was to acquire naval stations, especially naval stations in the Caribbean region, that would allow the United States to be able to defend its economic and military strength. We become one of those naval stations, and ultimately they find that it's not necessarily the best path for Virgin Islanders, quote unquote. Virgin Islanders are arguing this. People from the contiguous United States who are paying attention to our condition, quote unquote, are arguing this. And then you also have President Hoover visiting the territory and saying we are part of an effective fallout, and something has to be done to improve the conditions for the people that live here. So ultimately, when we look at American constitutional law, we know that our exclusion from the full access to American citizenry is connected to questions of our race. But then, since Congress has a free hand in determining how to govern said territories, Congress gets to determine which rights are fundamental and which are not. What this means is that technically the U.S. has the Equal Protection Clause, right? All people under the U.S. flag are supposed to be able to have equal protection under the law. People of color, especially in the continental United States, but also in the then acquired U.S. Virgin Islands, don't necessarily get equal protection. And the reason we don't get equal protection is because this idea of, well, what is a fundamental right that should be extended to the people of the territory is left up to the discretion of the U.S. Congress. ultimately, the wording is so ambiguous that legal scholars and often jurists themselves are able to kind of impose their idea about what necessarily constitutes a fundamental right. So there are tons of cases that start to take place at this time, especially between people in Puerto Rico and the continental United States, about trying to push the United States of America to define what constitutes a fundamental right. So ultimately, it's clear in like the political regard and the geopolitical sense that we're a colony. The other question then becomes, well, do we fit all of the other conditions for determining what a colony is? And ultimately, I think we may have to agree that the answer to that question would be yes. If colonialism is defined by a racist hierarchy that tends to privilege white bodies at the expense of non-white bodies, we can argue that the U.S. Virgin Islands has that. That we are a predominantly black society, however, we are not a black dominant society. And there is a difference between being the majority group in a population and being the group that's in power in a population. Now, this becomes even more confusing for us, I think, because, well, a lot of politicians are people of color, right? Everybody's black. However, Richard Gonzalez Allen, Audre Lorde, most of the scholars on the Virgin Islands openly conclude that, yes, okay, all of the politicians that are black, but the company, or not the company, the territory is still owned by a metropole, a colonizing power. And that this colonizing power ultimately sets the terms for how the society is structured. So when we say set the terms, well, what do we mean by that? We don't make militarized decisions for ourselves. We don't necessarily control our ports. We do not necessarily control our trade agreements. We do not necessarily control every aspect of the laws that we are subjected to, and we don't have electoral representation. And so in this regard, we have to admit that this is a colonial relationship, and it's also one where you have land exploitation. And this land exploitation is arguably most visible on St. John's. And this is why St. John becomes the focus of the dissertation, because that wasn't the initial intention. I had planned to do interviews and participant observations all across the U.S. Virgin Islands, and I interviewed a few people in St. Thomas, scheduled interviews in St. Croix, but people started saying things like, St. John is out of control. Or the gentrification on St. John is obvious. Or I don't like to go to St. John because it's depressing. Or when I go to St. John, I feel as though I don't understand why all of the businesses aren't owned by, quote unquote local people, or it seems as though the culture is being eroded. You have the national park, it's occupying most of the land. And so, but what people tend to follow that up with is, oh, St. Thomas and St. Croix will never be like St. John. That could never happen here. Here, means St. Croix in some context, St. Thomas in other contexts. And when I argue that St. John is a miner's canary for the entire Virgin Islands. And Lanny Guarnere and Gerald Torres argue that a miner's canary, if when people are going into the coal mines, they would take a canary in there with them, so that if the coal mine started to get toxic, the canary would start to let people know that it's deathly in here. And so they put forth an argument that black people are miner's canary for the United States, because anything that impacts or disenfranchises black people is evidence of a flaw in the democratic system. And while people think it will stay contained to black people, ultimately the violation of those rights tend to bleed into the rest of the body politic. So the exploitation of black women's reproductive rights was happening in the US before it became a mainstream policy. The police brutality of black and brown people was more obvious before people started realizing that the policing of white people could also be a problem. And then also when we even look at the war on terror, quote unquote, what we realize is that the evidence that the United States of America would violate people's rights to privacy is most visible when you started looking at the experiences of people of color. And so I argue that St. John is not a situation that could be quarantined. Ultimately, what's happening on St. John is evidence that there is a problem, a flaw in the political system that will continue to impact the entire Virgin Islands at increasing not addressed at the more fundamental levels. So we also have political corruption. And if you look at the scholarship on colonialism, one of the first things you see everywhere is that corruption is prevalent in colonial societies. Now, everybody has their opinion on why that's the case. Gordon Lewis in particular and other people argue that, well, that corruption takes place in part because the colonial relation was such that colonial officials were constantly bribing the local elite. And that this bad, quote-unquote, habit doesn't necessarily end in the aftermath of those overt colonial relations. That bribery, the political corruption, the nepotism, it was happening all the time during slavery and colonialism. But it became a political illness, so to speak, that never necessarily ends. So our political corruption is indeed conforming to the patterns of a colonial society. And then we obviously have a debt and financial crisis. We are facing a fiscal crisis of epic proportions. And while we constantly and typically argue that this is a result of overspending and mismanagement, I would agree perhaps if that is true. One of the other things that we have to ask ourselves is, what is the colonial relationship to debt? And what I mean by that is that the United States of America and other colonial powers are also in tremendous debt, but they do not have the fiscal crisis that we have. And so when you start to trace the scholarship on colonialism and economic theory, what you see is that debt is a part of the colonial project. We see this in the independent as well as the dependent Caribbean. And some scholars on race in the United States of America argue that we see this even in poor communities in the continent of the United States. And so ultimately, even our financial situation is indicating that there is a colonial dependency happening here. The other issue being, as it relates to peripheral economies, is that if we look at the research by Patrick Henry and others on small island tourism economies, one of the things that we realize is that one of the trademarks of a colonial economy is that it accumulates wealth, the colonial power, at the expense of the colonial entity. And so in the Virgin Islands in particular, it means most of the money that circulates in the US Virgin Islands, arguably, is going straight back to the continental United States. Whether we're talking through industry, whether we're talking through banking, whatever the case may be, most of the money is returning to the metropole. And if it's returning to the metropole, it's not staying and circulating here in a capacity that will allow us to fundamentally alter our society. So yes, we should deal with austerity measures. However, some scholars might argue that austerity measures necessarily are never going to be the solution to a problem that is inherently colonial. That if we look at Emmanuel Wallerstein and the world system theory, this relationship between colonial powers, core nations, and the periphery is set up intentionally. And so decolonization becomes the answer to our economic crisis. And then finally, one of the other examples of how colonialism is circulating here is also the question of environmental injustice. Caribbean islands, and colonies in particular, colonized, peripheral, marginalized spaces, whatever you call areas like ours, are arguably, according to several scholars, Baptiste and Rangi being one, are on the forefront of the climate change crisis. So, as Prime Minister Skerrit of Dominica said, we are facing first the impact of the war on climate change. However, arguably, we are not the biggest contributors to the climate change problem. Our contribution to climate change is marginal at best. And yet, we are ultimately the ones who are bearing the brunt of the environmental fury. Now we can ask ourselves, well, how did we even get to the place where we are overdeveloping and colonizing the planet to the point that the planet itself is unsustainable to address this problem? But then Sylvia Winter would tell you that our conception of the human is degrading also to the planet. That we are prioritizing the economy over our well-being as a human species. And that we are not only doing that, but we are conflating our interests as human beings with the interests of this bigger man. And so when we ought to be defending ourselves and defending the environment as humans, we still find ourselves circling back to man's interests. And what she means by that is that if we look at even the environmental movement, environmentalism, they are largely rooted in white supremacy. And clear examples of this include the Virgin Islands National Park and the National Park Service at large. The project of ecological conservation